sûr, ensuite, quiconque souhaite poser une question, le faire. Vous pouvez le faire en français ou en anglais, bien sûr. James, concerning your communication, my question was, how did these pirates present themselves? Did they qualify themselves as pirates, or did they use another vocabulary? Because piracy is often used as an external point of view. And in relation with this question, did they consider the actions against Spanish vessels during, for example, during the First World War as mere piracy actions, that is to say, for economic reasons, or did they saw them as political actions also in this context? And Mohamed, my question was about the autonomy of these US flyers on the Rif influence. Did they establish themselves their military actions, or were they directly under the orders of the French High Command or the Spanish High Command? Because you mentioned, for example, a dinner between these American flyers and Spanish high officers in Tetuan. So did they have a real room of maneuver, autonomous margin of maneuver? And where can we find other foreign fighters on the side of the Spanish and French armies during the Riffian War? Thank you.
Yes, maybe if I go first.
Maybe the microphone.
No, this one. Okay. Yes, so those are both very good questions, which I didn't really go into, partly for lack of time. Yes, I think piracy is largely an external category, and it's very important to realise that very few of these people involved in piracy were, if you like, professional pirates. It's not really a full-time job. The word used in the sources is mostly to describe them as sailors, as you'd expect, because they spend their life at sea. When they're generally acting as fishermen or transporting goods along the coast, sometimes also during the agricultural season acting as farmers. So it's very rare for them to actually be pirates for any length of time. And of course, also being very heavily involved in the smuggling trade. There are some examples of where the prominent figure arise, like Sabara might describe himself to a foreign journalist as being a pirate with a certain amount of pride, I think, because we have to remember that piracy has multiple meanings. It can be positive as well as negative. And I say that as a citizen of a country, England, is sometimes described as pirates by external observers, but that's been adopted as a badge of pride. And that certainly was the case during some of the debates on Brexit, which were describing the UK as a buccaneering nation. But yes, I think these are effectively a category of seamen who act on occasion as pirates, partly for economic motives. Obviously, the Reef at the time largely subsisting on agriculture, a certain amount of fisheries, but piracy an important economic source. But yes, it could slide over, I think, into political motives. I think Sabara himself was closely linked to Mohamed Amzian. In 1911, 1912, he was released by the Spanish, where he was being held prisoner in exchange for Spanish prisoners of war. So on occasion, I'm sure they could become mujahideen effectively. So it's complicated. And I think people have multiple motives, and piracy can be an internal as well as an external category.
Thank you for the two questions. Concerning the first question, the autonomy of the American aviators vis-a-vis the French, I would say no, there was no autonomy. They took their orders from the French commanders directly. There was at times, I wouldn't call it maneuver, but because the whole thing was improvised. Some flyers at times decided or chose to do otherwise. For example, on the bombing of Tarzout, for example, on the 16th of September, Rockwell himself, so Tarzout was bombed, but Rockwell, as he recounts in the memoir, found the village deserted. He couldn't see anyone. So he thought, why drop the bombs there? So the other Americans, of course, dropped their bombs and killed people, because from the newspaper reports we have reports about funerals and people dying. But Rockwell himself turned back and went to show and dropped his bombs. So this was, if you like, against the order. But yeah, sometimes they could do things which were not ordered by the French commanders. The second question about foreign fighters. Oh, absolutely. I mean, of course, the French and the Spanish case are different here. In the French case, as I said, the Escadrille was the only foreign unit, because legally there was no way to have a foreign unit. The only foreigners could only enlist in the Foreign Legion. And in the Foreign Legion, as we all know, not most, but let's say almost half, at least in the 20s and early 30s, almost half were Germans because of the economic crisis in Germany. But I believe statistically, for example, in 1933, 45% of the French Legion were Germans. In the 20s, it was a little less, but there were many Germans. There were also, in the Rif War, there were also many white Russians, who fought the Bolsheviks. And of course, a whole lot of other nationalities, but maybe the Germans and the White Russians were two of the most common nationalities in the Legion. As to Spain, it's a little bit, the Spanish Legion, although also they call it the Spanish Foreign Legion, the Tercio, but practically it wasn't really foreign, because most of them were Spanish. So it's different. It's true that Millán Astray established the Tercio with the idea, because he admired the French model, but in reality, most of them were Spanish. There were also other nationalities, obviously, but the Spanish Legion is a somewhat different story. I hope I have answered your question.
I might just add, as you're probably aware, there was a big scandal with the Spanish Legion. I think in 1921-22, when Millán Astray called for a lot of foreign volunteers to arrive, and he did recruit a large number of former British soldiers who served in the First World War. But they led a mutiny within months of arriving, protesting the poor pay and the poor conditions, and they had to leave. And I think it's become a sort of legendary event. And I think the foreign recruitment ceased. A lot of it ceased after that.
Yeah.
On peut ajouter juste sur la question de la Légion étrangère espagnole, la perception de cette Légion étrangère espagnole en France, qui est considérée comme un espèce de rebut, une sorte d'espace où ceux qui ne peuvent pas entrer dans la Légion étrangère française, notamment les déserteurs, peuvent entrer, ce qui explique aussi cette moindre considération, cette moindre renommée de cette Légion étrangère espagnole. Je laisse la parole à la salle, s'il y a des questions. Je crois qu'il y a un micro qui peut circuler, c'est ça, Aurélia? C'est cela?
Thank you. Just a question about public opinion in the United States about crime, about Abdelkrim, because we know it was very popular, so especially because of the recent points. In other words, support of Abdelkrim, is it a leftist cause at the time, or it's more popular?
Thank you for that question. It's an interesting question, actually. No, not necessarily. There was certainly a lot of enthusiasm for Abdelkrim's movement within the left, no doubt about that. And, liberal, center-left, leftists or radical leftist circles did cheer for Abdelkrim. During the campaigns of the Americans, and I'm talking especially in the, for example, the African-American community, on October the 25th, that is during the campaign by the Escadrille, the American Negro Labor Congress convened in Chicago. This was the inaugural big event for an African American labor movement. And so the war in the Rif and the participation of the Americans was a big subject in the speeches, the keynote address, and the resolution at the end of the Congress. They supported the liberation in sweeping, enthusiastic terms. I have to say also in a very marked racial language, because it considered the Abdelkrim and his movement, a personification of the will of the African people. And so this enthusiasm was expressed in very much racial terms. There was this report by the House of Representatives Special Committee to investigate communist activities. There were informants in the Congress, and one section of the report, it says that everybody, no exception, who talked at the Congress mentioned Abdelkrim and the support for Abdelkrim, and every time the name Abdelkrim was pronounced, there was a thundering applause among the delegates and the people attending the Congress. So yes, certainly the leftist circles did have a lot of enthusiasm for Abdelkrim, but also there was support and condemnation of the Americans in conservative and liberal circles. If you look at the newspaper editorials, some of the magazines, some even religious circles. I mean, if you look at the letters of the editors, you find letters from church pastors. So there was a widely common denunciation of the American participation in the war, which usually had at its ideal, this American ideal of, freedom, struggle for freedom, and that we need to support the Rifians because, after all, they are struggling for the freedom that our forefathers have also struggled for. So yeah, I could say it's certainly leftist, but also from other liberal or even conservative circles.
Maybe if I could add to that, I've not really explored the issue of US public opinion, but it's a mistake to think that international public opinion on the left was exclusively in favor of the Rif. The political right in some countries was heavily in favor of the Rif, especially in Germany. Particularly interesting example, you mentioned the number of Germans in the French Foreign Legion. There was a viewpoint among the right, German right, that the Rifians, like the Germans, are being occupied by France. France is still occupying the Rhineland at that point, still under military occupation. And therefore, the Rifians are similar to Germans in terms of their character, their capacity for resistance, and possibly even racially as well. There's an idea that the Berbers are Aryans, like Germans, and therefore we should support them, and it's shameful that Germans are in the French Foreign Legion. So yes, I think it goes across the political divide, but in quite strange ways.
I would like to add that among archives, there are a lot of photos from African American and German to Abdelkrim.
Yes.
So, il y a un travail de recherche à faire sur tous les courriers internationaux qui sont envoyés à Abdelkrim, qui sont interceptés au Maroc. Et là, il y a un impératif, je pense, à écrire cette question.
Thank you.
François, tu peux arrêter le partage d'écran parce que du coup, s'il te plaît.
Alors, je vais essayer de. Ici, là. Just arrêtez là.
Parce que du coup, voilà.
Ok, très bien. Ouais.
C'est bon.
Okay. Oui, dans la salle ou de la part de ceux qui nous suivent par.
Alors en fait, il faut regarder dans le chat.
D'accord. Oui, éventuellement. Okay, donc je prends dans l'ordre la première question. For my investigations, I would like to know about the British archives. Where can I find? Are there important things?
Yes, there's a lot in the British archives, particularly I'd say the Foreign Office archives, which are held in Kew. There's quite a rich resource. They took a lot of reports, particularly from, if I remember rightly, the British Vice Consul in Tetuan. And in Tangier as well. So there's quite useful reports because a lot of the Rifian diplomats would quite often approach the British to try and get British political recognition of the Rif and pitch their propaganda to the British. So there's some very interesting material in the British archives from 1921 to 26.
There was a question added to the first about the Rif Committee in England too.
Yes, so the Rif Committee was an organisation headed by quite a strange character called Robert Gordon Canning, who was a former British captain who served in the First World War. And he set up a support committee for the British and tried to act effectively as the Rifian spokesman abroad, heading delegations to the rest of the world on behalf of Abdul-Karim. I think he visited the Rif twice from memory. And we talk a lot about international support for Abdul-Karim and public opinion, but we shouldn't forget that international public opinion was largely indifferent to the Rif. You know, for many countries, it would have been a far-off conflict about which people knew nothing. And the Rif Committee was always tiny. It was maybe 20 to 30 people who were seen, certainly in political circles, as more of an annoyance than anything else. And they never really galvanized public opinion in the UK. I think there was a handful of resolutions, maybe at the Trade Unions Congress. There was a couple of MPs who spoke on behalf of the Rif Committee, but it never became anything like a popular movement. And it was a very minimal support in reality. But of course, the importance of the Rif Committee is that in particular, the French circles around Lyoté begin to believe that there was a British government conspiracy against France and the Rif, a slightly strange combination of France, Germany, and the Bolsheviks all working in alliance with Abdul-Karim against France. And that was the key thinking amongst some elements of the French High Command.
Thank you. Other question ou d'autres questions? Soit vous pouvez intervenir soit dans la salle, évidemment. Ceux qui nous suivent par Zoom sont tout à fait invités à se manifester pour poser des questions. Dans questions-réponses. Oui, c'est là où je suis. Je regarde en fait qui était là. Moi, si je peux me permettre, j'avais une question, mais qui déborde un peu le cadre des interventions des deux intervenants. C'était did you find evidences about relations between the Rif experience of the establishment of a republic and what occurred in the same time, practically in the same time in Libya with the experience of the Tripoli Republic established in 1918, or other connections with other theaters of war, of insurgency, aiming to establish counter states in confrontation to the colonial domination?
Yes, I think to a large extent, and what's striking particularly about this period directly after the First World War, when so many of the old structures of states and empires were being dissolved, is how much experimentation is going on right around the world. I think it's in Georgia, the Ukraine, has set up an anarchist republic for the first time. Lots of the former Russian territories are creating their own republics. There's 3, I think, German republics created in 1918. And so there's a huge amount of experimentation, not just in the Middle East, but right around the world, on the borderlands of China. And all these ideas, a bit like Abdul-Karim's ideas, slightly fuzzy. The idea that maybe you could have something that's a republic, but it's also a state that builds on existing ideas, that has Wilsonian principles included, and it's somewhat inchoate. But yes, I think there's strong parallels between what Abdul-Karim is doing and the 50 or 60 new states that were being created in 1917 to 1920. For the Tripolitania Republic, to my embarrassment, I don't know a huge amount about it. But I think that is an urban experiment, maybe is slightly different to the Rif. because that was based on the existing sort of city-state, effectively, of Tripoli. So it's somewhat different to the Chérifienne movement, which is based on existing sort of tribal structures, although they do have the same elite ideas about republicanism, nationalism, and the Wilsonian 14 points.
Thank you.
I have to be honest, I have nothing to say about the Libyan example or any parallels. So.
Right. Just a question of curiosity, because we are practically at the same time. The Tripolitan Republic was connected with the emerging pan-Arabist movement, and people like Sheikh Hassan, for example, who went who acted also as consultant for the Tripolitan Republic. And my question was about also this connection, maybe between the Chérifienne Republic and a more ample global movement of affirmation of Arab nationalism or pan-Arabist nationalism.
I think that's true. Sheikh Hassan, of course, is very important in writing about the Rif. And was one of the first big cases he takes on as an example of what can be done by the Arab nation. And, the Republic of the Rif becomes widely praised in the Syrian and Egyptian press, and as an example of what can be done in terms of Arab nationhood. And they tend to skate over the sort of Amazigh identity of the Rifians. But yes, I think it's like all these countries, like in Germany, like in Syria, like in Egypt, like in the UK, everyone reinterprets the Rif in their own political ideas.
Alors, oui, Badia Nahad, si vous voulez intervenir.
Oui, bonjour, j'ai une question par rapport à la piraterie.
J'essaie de mettre le micro près de... Allez-y.
Oui, bonjour, donc j'ai une question par rapport à la piraterie. Est-ce qu'il y a c'est-à-dire dans les archives sur lesquelles vous avez travaillé, une connexion entre la piraterie et la contrebande, surtout la contrebande des armes? Et puis, vous avez parlé de système de contrôle de la côte qui a été instauré par Crime. Et je pense que j'avais lu, je ne suis pas spécialiste de la question, mais j'avais lu que chez des historiens marocains, qu'ils ont travaillé surtout sur des archives marocains, qu'il y avait un système de l'ESA, ce qu'on appelle l'ESA, c'est le contrôle de la côte, qui était instauré par le Makhzen, donc la fin du 19e siècle, je pense déjà depuis la moitié du 19e siècle, mais ce système de contrôle, il était délégué aux tribus de la côte. Donc, est-ce que le système instauré de la crime était différent? Est-ce que c'était un système un peu confié est-ce que c'était le même système, c'est-à-dire confié aux tribus, ou il a instauré un autre système? Voilà, merci.
Yes, that's a very, very good question. In all honesty, I haven't explored the pre-existing system of control in terms of the surveillance of the coasts. I'm aware, of course, that smuggling became a major concern, especially after the Act of Algeciras in 1906, and a major concern from the European powers and the Makhzen itself to try and control arms smuggling in particular. And there were certainly systems put in place, particularly in the ports, to try and control goods coming in and out of Morocco. In terms of surveillance of the coasts, I think there was historically a system of surveillance, particularly to watch the Spanish peñons at Nacor and Losema. So that was existing in the Chérifienne coast already. But in terms of the late 19th century system of surveillance, I think, yes, I'd probably need to dig a bit more into that in all honesty. But thank you for the question. That's a very good point. And in terms of the difference installed by the differences with Abd al-Karim's rule, I suspect it would be more in the intensification of surveillance and the desire to really dig deep into maritime life in a way that probably hadn't existed in the Rif before. The Makhzen would have delegated to the tribes and exerted a fairly loose control, I guess, whereas Bin Abd al-Karim, in his seizure of shipping, and control of the coast was much more interventionist.
Merci beaucoup. Nous allons nous arrêter pour cette session, puis faire une pause avant. On reprend à 11h10. Voilà, donc on se retrouve tout à l'heure. Merci à tous et à toutes.